Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's webinar, QuickValue, Uncovering Companies' Value in 3 Easy Steps. And I think by the end of the hour, you'll know not only what those 3 easy steps are, but how easy they actually are. We're fortunate today to actually be joined by Reed Phillips, who's chairman of Oaklins International and co-founder of Oaklins, DeSilva and Phillips, a media investment bank that dates back to 1996. I'll tell you a little bit more about Reed in a moment. We're also joined by Charlie Slack of Charles Slack Communications. He worked with Reed on this book and is co-author of the book QuickValue. And I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group. Tell you a little bit more about Reed. He's chairman of Oaklins International, which is actually one of the world's leading middle market global investment banks. As I mentioned a moment ago, in 1996, he co-founded Oaklins, DeSilva and Phillips. Clients of his work have included Microsoft, Dun & Bradstreet, the New York Times, Condé Nast, The Economist, Deutsche Börse, and leading private equity firms that include TBG Growth and Avery Partners, as well as Shamrock. Reed, I think that your firm also played a role in Workman's acquisition by Hachette earlier this year.
Yeah, that's right, Brian. We represented Workman in the sale.
It's a transaction that got a lot of people's time and attention. Reed is with Charlie, the author of QuickValue, Discover Your Value and Empower Your Business in 3 Easy Steps, published by McGraw-Hill just this month. It provides an easier approach to valuing companies, and as Reed will have a chance to explain today, that's an important component of understanding a variety of things that impact your strategy and your overall approach to your business. Before he became an investment banker, Reed co-founded a magazine and a newspaper, and he was associate publisher at the New Republic magazine. He serves on the board of the Foreign Policy Association and is a graduate of Duke University. Charlie runs his own firm, whose clients include Time Inc., Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, UBS, Advanced Communications, and the Bessemer Trust, among others. Before that, he worked for Time Inc. Content Solutions and served as a reporter for 2 different newspapers, the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Chattanooga Times-Free Press. He's a graduate of Harvard College, and we'll welcome you both to present to this conversation today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
So maybe I could start by asking you, Reed, to talk about the work that's done by Oaklins. Kind of what kind of a firm is it? How does it operate, and how does it inform what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. Thank you. So Oaklins is an investment banking organization. We cover virtually every industry, and we're in 45 countries around the world with 850 investment bankers. Our group in New York, which was founded as DeSilva and Phillips, is now Oaklins DeSilva and Phillips, and we specialize in 3 industries primarily: media, marketing, and information. And what we do is primarily mergers and acquisitions for those industries. We'll sell companies, we'll be on the buy side representing a buyer in some cases, and we also do valuations. As you mentioned, we started the firm in 1996, so we're just going on 26 years. We have a full-time team in New York of 20, and then we have an additional group of senior advisors.
And Charlie, how did you get involved with Reed to work on this project?
Well, thanks, Brian. Yeah, I've been a business and financial writer for quite some time, and a mutual acquaintance of ours, Jeff Pundyke, introduced me to Reed, and I was really excited about these ideas that Reed has, because I've done a lot of writing. I love to write about middle-sized businesses in particular. Their innovation and the challenges they face, and their flexibility and dynamism. I just find them very exciting, and I've done enough writing about the subject of valuation before meeting Reed to know that this is something that mid-sized companies in particular struggle with. And they go from day to day working extremely hard, but often with very little idea of what the entity they're building is actually worth. And what I loved about Reed's ideas was that in addition to being able to get at that dollar figure, it's all about sort of the process of understanding what your true strengths and weaknesses are, being honest about those. And as you gain a fuller understanding of the different value drivers that are moving your company, this is information that you can use to grow as a company, not just have some dollar figure for an ultimate sale. So I just found it very exciting.
I mean, you bring up an interesting point, and because QuickValue is really written to help mid-sized companies better understand how they create value. Maybe we could start perhaps with you, Reed, and then Charlie, how you define a mid-sized company and what makes this book particularly useful to them.
Sure. Mid-sized companies are the ones that we typically work with at our firm. The mid-market is typically defined as companies with revenues of 10 million up to $1 billion. Below 10 million are kind of mom and pop shops, and above $1 billion are, large corporations. The mid-market is primarily companies that are privately held. There are certainly some publicly held companies, but it's primarily privately held companies. And those companies typically don't have the resources that large corporations have or that public companies have to be able to monitor their value constantly. Of course, public companies know every day the stock market's open what their company is worth, and they get that feedback constantly. Large privately held companies over $1 billion are going to have a strategic planning team and all kinds of executives like chief strategy officers, et cetera, who are going to do that kind of work. Mid-sized companies, as Charlie said just a minute ago, they tend to focus on, getting the work done and paying their people and hoping that revenues and EBITDA increase every year. And that's kind of how they measure their success. I've found, working with those companies over 30 years, that very few understand exactly what their businesses are worth. They might have a ballpark idea, or they might have picked up something at a conference where somebody said such and such a business sold for, a multiple of X times EBITDA, and they might even use those numbers themselves as they think about what their business is worth, but they've never really gone through the rigor of figuring out what their company is worth. And then we go even further in the book and say, well, that's not even enough. Once you figure it out, you need to monitor the value every year, and you need to build your strategy around increasing your value, partly by improving your value driver score. So we're really very focused on the idea that these companies on their own with their internal teams can determine what their value is and use it as a planning tool. And the reason they can do it on their own is because we've devised a system for them to do it, the QuickValue methodology, which is different from what you'll see in other valuation books.
And Charlie, from your perspective, having worked with mid-sized companies and reported on them, I imagine, anything that anything that kind of jumped out at you from
Sure, and I think
creating
Reed
this book?
covered it. Yeah, I think Reed covered it really well. I would guess I would say that what's crucial for these mid-sized companies is that they're they have ambitions to be much bigger companies, and they're often on the cusp of that. And as Reed says, the larger companies have the resources to know this at any given moment, what their value is. But at this crucial moment, mid-sized companies can't wait, because the decisions that they make right now could sort of help determine which direction they go in the future and how successful they are at getting to the next level. And understanding your value is sort of crucial to making those decisions.
Agreed. BISG has about 200, my organization has about 200 members, and of those, only a handful really are, $1 billion or more. It's fundamentally, book publishing in particular is a mid-sized market for most companies that are part of it. Reed, in the book, you focused on three questions. What is a company's value? How has it changed? And I think you just mentioned in the past year. And where is that value being created? And in some cases, I guess, where is it being lost? Why these three questions? What makes them important in crystallizing what you want to do with your company?
Yeah, I think those three questions really get to the heart of it, in terms of those are the questions we would like business owners to ask themselves, because it then naturally leads to the need for a process like QuickValue. And those are the really important questions to be asking about the business. Questions that are not often asked. Instead, there might be questions like, related to a variety of other things, but it's not very often that business owners are focused on those three questions, and we're trying to raise those questions to the level that we think they should be at.
And Charlie, imagine this is the kind of thing that drew you to the project. I mean, is the clarity around these three different?
Yes, I think that that focusing on three questions like this can provide you sort of a measure of objectivity. Reed has so many wonderful case studies over the years of companies that he's worked closely with that are so built on brilliant ideas and expertly run, and people pouring a lot into them, but sometimes decisions are based on emotion and clinging to something that maybe there's a long tradition of, and putting resources in that without recognizing how something else is swinging up on the other side and really starting to drive your future. And I think these three questions, by focusing on them, can help you sort of get a bit more of an objective perspective on your own company.
It feels, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, and Brian, I was just going to add that I think companies today in particular need to be focused on value creation more so than, say, 15 or 20 years ago, because 15 or 20 years ago, without all the digital disruption that we've been having, you could probably skate through several years where your value is going to stay the same and doesn't really matter. Not today. We see plenty of examples of companies that were worth, worth say 10 times EBITDA one year, and the next year all of a sudden they're worth 5 times EBITDA, because all the competitive landscapes change. There are more digital players. They become less relevant, and you have to track all of that and be aware of what's going on to valuations, so that you can be nimble and change your strategy. You can't just stick with the strategy for 10 years in a row. You've got to monitor the implications of the strategy and on your value. And so that's what that's the case we're making.
And I think the thing that you've made really clear in the book, both you, Reed, and Charlie, is that valuation is a component of strategy that effectively can influence and inform what you focus on and how you focus on it. And that's a critical connection that I think in your own assessment, many companies fail to make.
Yeah, and we, even to use a kind of a media company example, we've worked with companies who part of the business is, say, subscriptions and recurring revenue, and the other part is advertising sales. And those businesses if you divide them between subscriptions and advertising sales, have very different values. Subscriptions are, those businesses are trading at 15 times EBITDA. Politico sold for 15 times EBITDA, and so did Dennis Publishing, which publishes The Week, because those are subscription businesses. On the other hand, businesses that are driven off of advertising, that are print media, trade maybe for 5 or 6 times. Maybe they get up to 7 times, which is about where Meredith traded when it was sold to Dotdash. So if you're in both of those businesses, but you're trying to increase your value, of course, you want to focus much more on gaining more subscribers and being more efficient there, perhaps spending less time on the advertising sales part of the business. You don't necessarily need to give up that revenue. You just don't want to prioritize it over subscriptions, because subscriptions are going to drive your value to a much higher level.
It feels like answering these kinds of questions could be important to any company. And as you said, middle market companies tend to have fewer resources and more operational focus. I'm also wondering, can smaller companies benefit from this approach? I mean, your focus may be for companies with $10 million in revenues or more, but is a smaller company still eligible to benefit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you get, say, below 10 million or even below 5 million, you can still benefit, and you can grow to beyond 10 million, using some of the elements in the book. But the reason we focus on the middle market is that this is going to require some internal resources to do the work, and maybe 3 to 5 days of work. You'll probably want the CEO involved. You'll want your head of sales, your CFO, and maybe one of the owners or somebody else on the team. And so, organizations that are large enough to kind of have that kind of staff are the ones that we're really targeting. But again, you could very well go through the same exercises, but if you're less than 10 million in revenue.
And Charlie, I mean, I imagine in your experience, you've seen companies that fit the bill, that are smaller, even smaller than the mid-market.
I think it's a great question, and to me, just as we were talking a little bit earlier about how mid-sized companies are sort of large companies in the making, small businesses are tomorrow's mid-sized businesses. And I think that whether or not they, depending on the very outset stages, you may not be ready to go through the full QuickValue process, but certainly the reviewing and understanding your value drivers and keeping track of that closely on a yearly basis, and then beginning to think about the kinds of some of the things that Reed's ideas sort of are based on are things like adhering to generally accepted accounting principles and other kind of maturation points for a business that are extremely helpful. I think the earlier in the game you're aware of those and begin to adopt them, the more seamless it is for you to move from one level to the next.
And Brian, just if certainly large companies have these same issues. I have an example in the book. The Walt Disney Company acquired a large business from Fox that they paid billions of dollars for. And a year later, the value was found to be like $3 billion less than what they paid for it. And they lost all that value without even really knowing what was going on. And another very good relevant example of a big company is what Macy's is going through right now, where activist investors are encouraging Macy's to break the company in two. It'll be the e-commerce digital part versus the brick and mortar stores part. They believe that there's a lot of additional value to be captured if they split the companies, because the e-commerce digital businesses are valued so highly these days.
Agreed. And you have I mean, those are just two of the many examples within it. And the book is also structured with a little bit of a hypothetical to help bring home the core points that we'll be talking about in a minute. Reed, you recommended that businesses value themselves every year. It's probably the strongest recommendation you make in the book. Why is that so important to do? Why make it an annual exercise?
You know, again, largely with all the disruption that digital is causing, you know, you really need to kind of keep an eye on your valuation. And if you can monitor it and check in again a year later after you went through the exercise the first time, it'll be enlightening in terms of where the market's moving. You may have, within your business, you may have 3 different business lines, and they may all need to be valued separately. And you should be watching how those industries are evolving and where the values are increasing and decreasing, so that you can kind of adjust your strategies. And then it gives you time to work on your strategy once you know what your value is, and once you know your value drivers, you have a whole year to work on optimizing you know, your value through adjustments that you'll make in the value drivers.
And I think you recommend in general timing it to either at or ahead of the budget prep each year, so that you kind of think about what you need to work on, and then you plan for it for the following year.
Yeah, that would be ideal. Yes.
You mentioned before the right people to get involved include folks like the owner or the CEO, if it's different from the owner, so the chief financial officer, and perhaps some of their staff. But you also use in the book that it's important to get some of the non-traditional players when it comes to strategy. That you used a good example of a sales VP who might be reluctant to participate in an exercise like this because it takes them off the street for a few days. You know, who else should be on the team when you're thinking about evaluating the business drivers?
Yeah, I just did the exercise with a client recently, and it was really interesting because we had the CEO, the CFO, and we had the head of creative. And what I found particularly interesting was each of us looked at my list of 45 value drivers, and we tried to pick the ones that were the most appropriate for that company. So we were looking to choose 10. The person that was the most in sync with me turned out to be the head of creative. He and I had almost the exact same value drivers. The CFO had some that maybe were more financial, and the CEO had some that were, you know, in another area. But it was really interesting that that person just clicked right in with thinking about the business in a way that I think outside investors would look at it. And that's hard to do, to have that subjectivity to pull away from your business and say, if I was, the best way to do it and think about it is to pull away and say, well, the company that I'm working for needs an investment of $1 million, and they want me to put the money in. So if I'm going to put the money in, what areas am I going to really focus on in evaluating this company to make sure it's worth it to put the money in? And that kind of takes you away from the day-to-day. Oh, my department does a really good job, and the other someone says department's not so good. But if you kind of pull away, you can say, well, what are we really good at? Are we great at marketing? Are we great at content production? You know, and you can kind of rate yourselves on each of those areas.
And Charlie, imagine this is probably one of the things that really resonated with you if you've been working with small and medium-sized businesses for a while. The idea of having a tool that will pull together conversations inside a company.
Absolutely. And I think that the idea of having the creative people involved is so essential, particularly during that value driver phase. And you mentioned the example of somebody who's sort of maybe the head of sales. Well, they're out on the front line. They're hearing things. They're hearing things about the product that others might not hear. They're hearing about how their customer complaints, issues they have are working or not. That maybe somebody in a more financial role might say, well, we invested X amount in our new computerized customer relations system and things seem to be going fine there. Let's talk about the next thing. The head of sales might have a very different perspective to add. One thing I would say about the makeup of the team, interestingly, that the owner and the CEO can be essential parts of this, but that's the pressure is really on them to add their institutional knowledge and add their viewpoints without sort of coming in like a ton of bricks or guiding or coming in with expectations. I heard that companies like ours should be X times EBITDA because that's going to be everybody's North Star. So it's a delicate role that the leader of the company, if they're going to be involved, has to play to really welcome true objectivity, especially when it comes to evaluating things like strength of leadership, for example.
I'm sure that both of you could tell a ton of bricks anecdotes. So, but we won't, in the interest of both time and privacy, we won't ask. The book recommends that, and I think this is your point of view, that each company should identify what drives value for their products or services. And you have, as you mentioned, 45 potential drivers that you see, and you generally ask to winnow it down to 8 to 12 core choices. Maybe I'll start with the easy question. Picking from a list of 45 variables, and we can put them up if you'd like, could take a lot of time. How do you keep it quick in that sense?
Well, there are probably some that you can rule out almost immediately. They're just not going to be applicable to your business. The 45 try to cover all industries, and some are just not going to be relevant for your industry. And then you want to next, if there may be some, you may end up with, say, 30 that are relevant. You want to look at the 30 and say which ones really impact the value of my business. If I was coming in and looking at this as an acquisition target and thinking about buying the company, what would be the most important things? Would it be the leadership team? Would it be the business model that the company has, the market that the company's in, the customer relationships? I mean, and you would really want to look at those, say, 30 that you've boiled it down to, and get to 8 to 12. I think some are going to just jump off the page, and you're going to say, "Yep, that's critical for our company." If you're like a recurring revenue business, obviously, recurring revenues is going to be high on the list. If you when it comes to looking, say, for example, at the team, I think we look at both the leadership, and then we look more broadly at the team. In some cases, you'll have, we sold a company last year. The CEO of the company was absolutely critical to the business and added a lot of value. He had written a best-selling book that was ranked by the Financial Times, one of the 5 best business books of the year. He's someone that has the ear of CEOs in the Fortune 500 because of his thought leadership skills. So he's absolutely one of the value drivers in that particular business. Whereas you could have another business where there are 3 or 4 top leaders in marketing and production, manufacturing, et cetera. And they may all be really critical to the business. And it's a team that you're evaluating rather than just the leader. So it's, you just have, these are very unique, I think, to each business. And this is what makes each business unique. I mean, it is the value drivers that make up the business. It's so important, I think, that you end up picking the right one. So important that, in fact, I think we say in the book that you might want a trusted third party advisor to also take a look over your shoulders and make sure you're picking the right ones. Maybe it's your lawyer, maybe it's an accountant that you work with, or an investment banker that you have a relationship with, or your management consultant. But that would give you, a more, that would add more objectivity to the process of selecting the most important 8 to 12 value drivers.
And I would just add that I think the word is quick, not cursory, because we want this to be this needs to be a vigorous debate and something that you spend good time with, going back and forth. And there are a handful that on the list that are marked as key value drivers that to sort of help you narrow, that would be on many, if not most, such as market size, barriers to entry, intellectual property, that are going to apply to most. So that should help narrow it down. But as Reed says, also, there are some, I think the example I loved, Reed had this one for that if you're making Parmesan Reggiano cheese based on a method that goes back to the Middle Ages, then product life cycle is not going to be your main concern as a value driver, nor is franchisee relationships going to be if you're not involved in a franchise relationship.
And I think one thing that we've kind of skipped over a little bit is that after you pick that short list, let's say it's 10 that are selected from this list, you then ask anyone doing this work to value themselves, to value essentially to weight the criteria, but also to score themselves on I think on a 10-point scale, to say, how good are we at this, and to try and be really honest. That's got to be a eye-opening exercise for any company doing this kind of work.
Yeah, I think so. In fact, after we finished the book, I was thinking about it, and I kind of ran through this exercise with my own company, Oaklins, and decided to think about the business that way. And it really, you put it just exactly right. It could be really eye-opening, because a lot of people just don't think about it in those terms. Again, I think too many business owners are focused on revenue, EBITDA, those easy measurements. But when it comes to things like value drivers, this is how outsiders are going to look at your business. If they're going to buy your business or invest in your business, these are the things that they're going to be evaluating, along with, of course, revenue and EBITDA. But and it's really important that you understand how you rate in these areas, and you work to make improvements where you can.
I started to do the same for my small nonprofit trade association. We're not for sale, at least not that I know of. But it was, as you described, a somewhat sobering exercise.
Yeah, I think the temptation might be to sort of make this your greatest hits. Like, what are the 8 to 10, 12 things that we do best? But it's really, that's the essence here, it's what are the things that are the most important to us and to our success. And as Reed pointed, the key thing is, like, how are others going to be judging us? And then brutal honesty about the highs and the lows, and with the lows, what can we do about those?
One of the things that struck me in reading this, because I work in the book business, I tend to look at things through that lens. And some of the drivers seem to fit really well within book publishing, which is fundamentally a rights business. So intellectual property, which is part of the business model drivers, you see it second on that list. And licensing agreements, which is part of third-party relationships, seem like core value drivers for at least for some types of book publishers. Is that something that you see? And do you have a perspective on how well some of the publishers that you're familiar with are managing their work in these two areas.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think you know, entertainment companies, book publishers, a lot of media organizations, you know, intellectual property is a really important component to the value. And then you look at issues like, do they own the intellectual property? Do they have to pay any royalties on it? I was just looking at a business that was promoting itself, and one of the advantages was that they have a lot of intellectual property, and when it comes to royalties, they're only paying royalties on about 50% of their revenues. So the other 50% are wholly owned by the company. And so that's an advantage when an investor or a buyer is looking at a company like that.
Do you have a perspective, either you read or Charlie, on how publishers or media companies in general are doing in this area? Is this an opportunity to improve, or is the management uniformly good?
You know, I think I'm you know, we within book publishing, when Houghton Mifflin was for sale, I think there was a lot of focus on what you could do with the intellectual property beyond book publishing. And I think that was seen as a value driver for that particular business. You could develop television shows, film projects, etc. And if you had the ability to develop that kind of entertainment, you know, you could perhaps see more value in the company than other buyers.
Yes.
So I think that's, I think a lot of those companies maybe have capabilities like that, but they aren't being exploited. If they were being exploited more broadly across the intellectual property, that could make the companies more valuable.
And I think in a similar way, when it comes to things like intellectual property and licensing, how important are contracts, for example, that protect custody when there's a change of control? So if you're thinking about selling a company, imagine that if you have a wide range of contracts that require review, that's going to either encumber a sale or potentially lower value.
Exactly right. That would be a major problem for a buyer. They would really want to make sure all those contracts would transfer over. And if there were some that just weren't going to, for some reason, transfer over, they, as you just said, that they would view the company as worth less than a company where all the contracts were assignable.
And I think what we didn't spend any time on and the book, it really goes into really good detail on how you establish a valuation. But as you pointed out in some of your early remarks, Reed, businesses can often be more than one thing. And in fact, these days, it seems like you're always more than one thing. And it's important, as you say in the book, that you know your niches as a component of both strategy and valuation. You outlined some tools to help middle market companies figure out where they compete. But is this also an area where your friends, your trusted friends and advisors can provide some perspective on where the industry is and where you sit within it?
Yeah, definitely. And that's, you know, the advantage of sometimes bringing in an outsider who, you know, sees, you know, and maybe works with or observes, you know, 15 or 20 companies in your industry rather than just your one company. And they have insight into those companies, and they can then kind of evaluate your company vis-a-vis how those other companies are doing and give you some perspective that you might not otherwise have. So it's I think it's important to kind of seek that kind of feedback, whether you're doing, you know, this valuation work or not. I think it's important to just always seek that kind of feedback.
Right.
I was just going to add one thing on the value drivers. Brian, I thought that you put your finger on the button with the ones that really apply to the book publishing. I was thinking a couple of others, of course, are brand equity and the power of your name and building trust with readers. And then the other would be barriers to entry. You know, one of the interesting things that we actually spoke with the head of a utilities company who was talking about, you know, it's not just other utilities that you need to worry about anymore. Now it's the family down at the end of the street with their own batteries and their own, who want to sell you back power. And talk about an industry that's where the barriers to entry have changed. Publishing is sort of the definitive one, isn't it? Where now your competition isn't just the handful of other great publishers that are doing your kind of book. It's coming from every direction at once.
Yeah, well, it's one of the things that makes this job interesting.
Yeah.
Among many.
Brian, I had an example in the book from the book publishing industry. Charlie and I were trying to explain that when you do evaluation, in some cases, you can't just work off of 1 year of results. You have to use multiple years. And that's occurs in hits-driven businesses, which can be, you know, movie companies. The example I used in the book was Scholastic with the Harry Potter series. So every year when they would have a Harry Potter book come out, you know, the performance of the company would skyrocket. And then when there was no Harry Potter book in the next year, it would kind of go back down to the level it was at until the next Harry Potter book came out. So that makes it harder to pinpoint valuation. Do you value the company on the Harry Potter year or the non-Harry Potter year? What you have to do is probably average the years out, maybe use 2 or 3 years so that you're, you know, getting the number at what it would be on an average basis. And then that becomes the basis for the valuation.
Yeah, I think then you have to add a driver, which is more Harry Potter books. So we'll go to questions in a minute, but before we do, I wanted to ask you both to talk a bit about setting multiples for transactions. The book offers a pretty specific approach that's grounded in both public company data and some private transaction reports. For details, I think, you know, we really should recommend that people buy the book. You might recommend that no matter what. But I think the book is really good as a resource there. Maybe talk about the idea behind the approach that you recommend. I mean, what are the principles that you're trying to, they come up with realistic multiples?
Yeah, the thing that we're trying to, the thing we're focusing on are public company multiples. The reason we're doing that is because those are very, very current and fresh. So when you're in an environment where multiples are changing from quarter to quarter, you want the ones that are the most current, how investors are valuing your industry. So we rely on public company multiples. We want each industry to have 15, and we want you to select the 15 of the most representative of your industry. We've gone a little bit further and provided an index that Oaklins has now for about 100 industries that you can find when you go to QuickValueMethod.com. It'll take you to the index. So you won't have to do the work for those 100 industries. We'll provide it and show you what the multiples are. And then you need to kind of modulate the results from public company multiples by private transactions, because private transactions tend to be for small or mid-sized companies, whereas the public multiples are often for companies that are over $1 billion in revenues. And smaller companies generally are valued at about 25% less than public companies. So you want to know what the differential is, and then you need to apply that. And that's where it gets a little bit tricky in the analysis, but it's important to do, and certainly can be done. The fallacy in trying to use just private transactions is that they occur infrequently. So you might have a deal in your industry that occurred last month, but the one before that was 8 or 9 months ago. And so you're using old information. As you go back, if you go back even beyond a year, you're using very old information on the multiples. And that's why we focus so much on the public companies, because that information is so current.
And Charlie, you must have had a lot of fun figuring out how to talk about that particular approach.
Well, as I think you just witnessed, Reed is very good at explaining these things in a very clear manner. And I think one of the things that was really essential about these ideas and calculations that he's come up with is that it captures the best of both. You have sort of the accessibility and completeness and up to date of the publics, and then modified by the private information that you get that sort of brings you around to the best combination that you can then take the sort of personalized, if you will, information that you've gotten from your own company and then bring it all together. And then that's what produces your QuickValue.
Yeah, and there's a component that we're kind of skipping over today in the interest of time, but you also take the work that's been done to value your company and place yourself on a continuum between the high and low and the high transactions within that marketplace.
Yeah, that's where Brian, that's where the value drivers come in. So
Right.
you determine your value driver score, which will be, it could be, your score could be 20%, 25%, or it could be 75%. The higher the score, the higher your valuation is going to be when you are determining where you are on the valuation index.
Yeah, and there's a really good outline of that approach. It's really spread across 2 chapters, but it's an effective way to think through not just how am I doing, but how does it apply to the value, and really well laid out in the book. We have time for questions, and if folks have them, feel free to put them. The Q&A box is the easiest, but if you also put it in the chat. We had one observation from Richard, just saying he's a mid-sized company, and he sees one of the best leverages for growth for his company is acquisition. And valuing his own organization obviously has great benefit for improvement, but how is it that you would look at a company that, for example, is really good at acquiring other companies, maybe acquiring and integrating them? How does that drive value in your thinking?
Oh yeah, that's a really great example. I'm working with a company right now, and we determined that one of the value drivers is indeed their ability to acquire and integrate very quickly. They bought a company at an attractive price, but dramatically increased the value of their overall company post that acquisition by integrating it fast. And that's in a way they've proven that they can do that again and again. And so that's certainly a value driver for a company to have that capability. Often we see cases where you put 2 companies together and 1 + 1 is 3.
We don't have too many other questions, but I wanted to maybe start by just asking you, we've covered a lot of ground today in terms of walking through both the methodology and your thinking about the marketplace, but I don't want to limit you to just one takeaway. Maybe Charlie, if I started with you, is there a message that you want people to take away after listening to this conversation? I mean, of course, beyond buying the book.
Well, I think it's what excited me most on getting familiar with these ideas is to think of valuation not just as sort of the end of the rainbow scenario of after all this hard work and I'm continuing to work and grow my company, and then someday there will be this sort of reward, and that's the time to think about valuation. I would think that if there's one lesson to come away with from this book, it's that valuation is an integral part to where your company is right now, whether you're planning on selling next year or 20 years from now, or you're hoping that it's a legacy company that you're going to pass it down for 5 generations to come. Valuation is essential to your growth and your strategies at every step.
Reed, before maybe we lost Reed for a moment. It could be a dog or a doorbell. There's thanks for coming back.
Yeah, sorry about that. My dog was barking. That one of the challenges of working from home.
Absolutely. Well, it's not a Zoom call if you don't have one dog.
There you
just
go.
one
There
dog.
he is.
Before I ask
I
you,
thought Charlie did a great job of answering that question. That was exactly the answer.
thank you. No, don't worry about it, Reed. It'll be fine. We'll edit it on playback.
I think those were some additional insights, but only canine companies will come away with value from that answer that we just heard.
Exactly. I wanted to add just an observation, Reed, before we go. And it's Richard, who'd also made the observation about the effectiveness of acquisition. He's just saying he's also seen examples of large media companies that have acquired mid-sized companies only to either kill them or have them acquired, the acquired company buy itself back. And I don't know the examples that he's specifically citing, but I mean, I think that's where you would use the example before of a Disney buying and then finding that it lost a lot of value. That's the kind of the value of doing this on a prescriptive basis rather than after the fact.
Yeah, exactly right. And that is something that certainly can happen. We see it. I don't want to say all the time, but it definitely happens. Not all acquisitions work. Sometimes there's a culture clash, and sometimes the acquiring company doesn't really know what to do with the company they just bought. And in those cases, there are times when the founder will buy back the business.
I wanted to just put up before we go a few links. One is to the website that Reed mentioned, QuickValue Method. There's a variety of resources independent of the book, although there's a number of references within the book to the site and to its utility, as well as contact information for Reed and Charlie. And if you just need one email address and somebody to follow up with, info@bisg.org will get to me and to Jonathan. Reed, Charlie, thank you very much for making the time today. Congratulations on the publication of the book. It's probably the one trade association you'll ever deal with that knows how hard it is to be in the book business. And we're glad to have you be part of it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Brian, for the great questions, and we really appreciate it. And it was fun talking to your group.
And I would just say thank you as somebody who's loved books my whole life and written books, and I just thank you for everything that all of you do to keep this industry going and thriving through such change.
Well, it's our pleasure, and we wish you the best for the holidays and a happy New Year. And Reed, I'm sure we'll cross paths sometime again soon.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.